Welcome to Clif's Wujo. A dojo is a place in which the martial arts are practiced. A wujo is a place in which the woo-woo arts are practiced. The woo-woo arts are all things officially denied and everything unknown. Good morning. It's August 9th, 2012, 7:39 a.m. My butt's sitting here in Olympia, Washington, Pacific Northwest of coast of North America. Interesting place, Puget Sound. I'm actually just going to take a second to describe it for you. Olympia is the furthest, most southern point of Puget Sound. So we're sort of like the, I guess you'd have to say the sun coast of the Puget Sound. We're not really, because there's a nice area up in Squim that is in a rain shadow, and so they get more sun than we do. But I'm several nautical miles, well over 80 nautical miles from the actual coast, yet I'm 105 feet off the water. The water is connected to the ocean, yet in no way is ocean water really. It's more brackish because it's fed by all of the streams that come from all of the hills around us. We don't really have a interior coastal plain around Puget Sound. It's the topology around here is really interesting because it's very fjord-like, and actually speaks to the idea that this is in fact a mountainous region that has been flooded out because there are no coastal or alluvial or what are known as drift plains where material is deposited. We're forming them now in Puget Sound, but it's they're very shallow and in essence recent. Since human habitation, we've caused a lot of material to come off the hillsides, and it's sort of filling up bits and pieces of the sound, and we have to do dredging and this kind of thing. Anyway, though, Puget Sound is interesting for other reasons, not only the concentration of people and the military, the proximity of the volcanoes, and our position relative to the weather patterns of the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to stop there for a second because that was really the point of all of this little section, is to say that if you're in central parts of the United States, from our perspective here, we usually see the weather that's going to sweep across, at least to the Rockies, about a week to 2 weeks ahead of it actually doing that, because it has to come along here. It bumps over the Cascades and fiddles around east of the mountains and bumps over some mountains in Idaho and gradually works its way to the east. But recently, I've got to say that the weather patterns we're seeing here are atypical even within our non-normal. And so it's my thinking that the current heat patterns within the central part of the United States are not going to be broken by weather that is coming in from the Pacific, which used to be the case. You would get, several years back, you'd get these little heat bubbles over certain parts of the country, and eventually we'd get a storm large enough here off of the Pacific that it would sweep across the Cascade Mountains and disturb the upper reaches of the atmosphere from, say, 400 millibars up to 800 millibars, which includes the jet stream, and it would get everything all roiled up and in these not convergence zones, but these layers of trapped heat would be dissipated by the storms coming across from the Pacific. And that's no longer the case. The storm patterns that we're seeing now and the shift in the jet stream are taking everything into the very high Arctic, what storms we do get, or very far south. So the expectation I have is that the current rather nasty weather patterns may continue well into what we would traditionally think of as fall. And again, it's not, this is our new non-normal. I mean, it's an evolving situation. There's no stability here and likely not going to be for some time. Speaking of time, let's stop for a second and discuss that in the end of things, actually. The Mayan calendar, the Mayan long count ends on December 22nd, 2012. However, that was one of 5 or 6 counts in several calendars. So their calendars don't end, but the long count does. And then presumably it starts back up. Curiously, there's all these other cycles, and you get people making wild-ass claims that, that the pyramid inch, if you track it down, equals 2012, and basically we're all in deep shit, and the pyramids tell us this. And that's fine. I don't care much about the pyramids and someone's supposition that they know what it was actually built for, and how it was built and what the progression of the measurements mean. What we do know is that we've got strange things going on. It's quite demonstrable that we no longer have even the reasonably stable weather patterns of the 1970s and 80s, and we've really degraded since the 90s, and things have certainly changed. We have historically all different kinds of oddities going on, and the coincidence of these other cycles, pyramids aside, we have forecasts in other cultures that are coincident temporally with the end of the long count. And the one that I'm talking about at the moment is the Hindu, written about primarily in Sanskrit in the earlier form, of the idea of the Yugas, the concept that they would take the great ages of man and slice them and dice them, and there would be a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age. And the iron age is when all the crap happens, and we're in it now. And they called this iron age the Kali Yuga. Yuga basically means age, and Kali is the female version of the duality of the destructor. The male version is Kalki. And Jay Weidner's made a really cool movie, which you should get off his butt and release, all about the coming of Kalki. Anyway, so it turns out that, there's been various different, over the years, disputes that have arisen as to when the Kali Yuga started, when it ends, what year are we really in Hindu time versus what year are we in astronomically, and, all the way down to what year we are in anybody else's calendar. But the Kali Yuga math has been, to my mind anyway, because I've gone through a great deal of it, been straightened out with the not reinterpretation, but retranslation of a couple of statements by some famous people, mathematicians in ancient times that had done some work relative to the Kali Yuga, among others. And it turns out that this one guy upon which everything was pinned, in terms of the linchpin as to what year we're in now relative to the Yugas, he had an interesting take on it all. He was a strange little mathematician, and he didn't want to live in the Kali Yuga. He didn't want to be living in the Iron Age. At the worst, he wanted to be living in the Bronze Age, because Bronze was better age than the Iron Age, and he knew that all the crap happened in the Iron Age, the Kali Yuga. So anyway, this guy fudged the numbers, and they've actually come up with something that says, in a roundabout way, where he admitted that he fudged the numbers because of a personal issue of him not wanting to be alive in the Kali Yuga. In any event, though, so you take out all these fudge factors and redo the math, and it turns out a really good estimate as to when the Kali Yuga ends and the beginning of the next golden age would be 2025. And there's this issue of this small age of transition, which we're actually in from 2012 to 2025. And basically these 13 years, coincident to the Mayans, or homage to them, from the transition of the Kali Yuga into the Golden Age, is a period of a rather, let's say that it's ambiguous. The descriptors that we give for the transition show that the nastinesses of the Kali Yuga, insofar as how it's described relative to human interaction, the rise of the age of deceit and the greed and the monstrosities that we can and horrors that we commit on each other, were all really described in the Kali Yuga. Now, in the transition period of time, there is not that as a factor. Bringing this up because it relates to something that we're going to get into later on. But the transition period of the Kali Yuga into the Golden Age is a period in which humans are less likely to be battling each other than battling the environment and universe at large to establish our right to survive. thrive and progress. So the descriptor for the Kali Yuga is curiously close to some of the stuff we're getting here out of Courtney Brown's RV experiment, remote viewing experiment, as well as the follow-up remote viewing experiments that I've had done. I've had 2 of these studies done, and I'll discuss them briefly here because they relate again to this Kali Yuga thing. In the Kali Yuga description, for instance, the transition years are marked by a noted lack of central authority and even warlord kind of activity, which are very prevalent in the Kali Yuga itself and are spoken of, frequently. So, just a curiosity, it says, though they're saying, well, the Kali Yuga could be interpreted to say that the transition years to 2025 would be so bad that no one would even think about putting the energy into being a fascist because it's too much trouble. You got to try and stay alive. That kind of an idea. And government is all about fascism. Fascism equals government. Government equals control and force and so on. And trying to control someone else when you're trying to stay alive takes a lot of your energy. So it's a calorie issue. Anyway, though, here's another interesting part about the Kali Yuga. The Kali Yuga description is interesting because I found some, you'd have to say they were physics prophecies, I guess, that describe a situation in which there is a blending or emerging of the duality of time. Now, let's talk about time for a second here. There's 2 aspects of it. The Greeks noticed it, the Romans noticed it, and the Romans codified it. The Greeks labeled it as Chronos and Kairos. Chronos, the mechanistic form of time, and Kairos, the quality of time, the emotional or carrier part of time. So, in Kali Yuga, they knew that there were these 2 kinds of time as well, and they have their words for them, and they're basically Chronos and Kairos, mechanistic versus emotional. And in the Kali Yuga descriptions, there's a little hint of some stuff there from a couple of people that say that there's actually going to be a physics change in the environment in which we live as we transit back to the Golden Age. Now, bear in mind that virtually all the cultures around here, when you talk about Golden Age, especially in the Hindu stuff, you talk about people that, live 800, 900 years, they don't get disease, all of this kind of stuff. And it's a good time, pies grow on trees at will, that sort of thing. So it's basically a time when the physics that we've enjoyed or been through in the Kali Yuga, perhaps do not apply, and that may be a good thing. In any event, though, there's this little weird set of 3 guys who were independent of each other across about 2.5 centuries. Of course, the latter 2 you don't know. They could be referencing the first guy because they could have known about him. But nonetheless, there's a concept that these 3 people apparently had independently, in which they explored some of the physics involved relative to the math. And they say that fundamentally what happens is this, that every 13,000 years we transit through one of these mega cycles. As we make this transition at 13,000 years, a tonality of physics shifts. And on one half of basically it's a duality within duality within duality kind of thing, because the 13,000 years is only half of a 26,000 year cycle. Coincidentally, that is close enough to the cycle of the precession of the equinox that we might as well consider them to be the same. In any event, though, the 13,000 year cycle shift is characterized by a fundamental, from a perceptive viewpoint, change in the nature of time. And so we've been in, if you will, the downside here, the Kali Yuga side, where we have the 2 components of time. We have the Chronos and the Kairos. And to a certain extent, we are driven by the Chronos because the mechanized world is entirely about meeting the demands of that next second, taking your energy drink so you have the energy to get to that next second. And by the way, no one should ever drink those horrors. And if you're ever taking any of the Prozac or any of this kind of stuff and you drink energy drinks, you may be placing yourself at huge risk to become maniacal and be easily mind controlled simply because of the effect of the energy drinks on the underlying chemicals that form the antidepressants. So just as an aside, okay, but here the Chronos, the mechanistic form of time, keeps us progressing from moment to moment. Got to make that appointment. Got to get to that next thing. And these are all, I mean, this is all an illusion, people. You don't have to get to that next appointment. This next second does not drive you, and time need not be related to this way. But we've all grown up and all lived in a world that where this form of time separation, where Chronos dominates, is been taking over the planet minute by minute, second by second, spreading out into all of those areas that are not affected. So even, I mean, there's undoubtedly places where you have tribal societies that don't have a watch, but those are few and far between anymore. So anyway, so here's the deal. These three Hindu scientists of ages back suggested, because they were there at a point where we transitioned into the Kali Yuga, and they were highly perceptive individuals, and they felt this separation finally occur between the Chronos and the Kairos, that it was their perception that the shift at 13,000 years was all about the fusing and unfusing of time. So when we go into the golden age, it's going to be a period where the characteristics of time will be perceptively different, where the Chronos and the Kairos will not be separate, where the flow of time relative to the Chronos, which I can describe why that exists, and we'll do so in a minute just to annoy the crap out of everybody who's never heard it before. But where the Chronos won't be driving us, the Kairos will be dominant, and the two will be so fused that we won't be able to separate them. Now, bear in mind, Kairos is something that a lot of people do not feel. I've known people that where they just are not perceiving the flow or the character of the time of the moment. In other words, when you hear these Hindus and these Taoists and stuff, and they say live in the now, they usually don't preface it or follow it up by stating that, you know, the now is ever changing. The now is not constant. It is not a static thing at all. In fact, it's delightfully alive, and it expresses the Kairos through the now. And, you know, it's like, duh, we should probably point that out, you know, meditation and time flowing for dummies, that the now is not this static void kind of an issue. The now is this sparkly bright part of the whole mystery of time, in that it encompasses primarily and is driven by the Kairos. And you got to get in the age of the Chronos, in the age of the Kali Yuga that we're in now. You got to work your ass off. You got to meditate to get into the now, and it's hard to live there because the Chronos is always sucking you back. This is the backsliding that's talked about in the science of yoga, and how the universe itself is attempting to draw you back into the flow of it all and not let you, quote, escape. I hate using that word on it, but in any event, so the theory is that after 2025, all this shit will be a lot easier. You won't have to worry about it so much. You'll be able to flow with the Kairos. You might find yourself living to be 800 or 900 years old and having a good time doing it. And you may even get trees to grow pies for you. In any event, I'm not really counting on that, but the whole point of the discussion was to bring up these issues of time and how we don't really look at things the way that we should, or that might be beneficial to us. Again, we shouldn't use the pejorative words like should. Time cycles, Kairos and Chronos, affect us even now continuously, and we can't help that in ways that are hidden. And so, let me say that there's an old Arab curse. This old Arab curse is, let him who is offended universe be delivered into the hands of a physician. Which, boy, I mean, never has there been uttered a greater truism. You are cursed if you are so handed. Now, here's the thing. In Western world, physicians don't know about Kairos. They're hardly aware of Chronos. They're driven by it, but they really pay no attention to it. They're not trained to be self-examining. They're, by nature, if they were self-examining individuals, the training they go through beats that out of them, and they're totally desensitized to all of that. So, for instance, if you were to go and ask ask all the accredited physicians and, quote, doctors in the Western world how long a person can take a drug. It doesn't matter what the drug is. Let's just say Zoloft or any of these other drugs. Does not matter. There's some drugs that, they would say, oh, you can't take it very long because it'll irritate your stomach. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the nature of long-term alteration of the human body via drugs and our approach to it. All these doctors are under the impression there's nothing to stop you from taking a drug forever. That if it works for you, well, you might as well take it forever. And that's their whole precept. So they might as well give you Ritalin when you're 6 or an antidepressant when you're 5 and just take it the rest of your life. But here's the problem, guys. These people the physicians are abysmally ignorant. They are hugely brain crammed with minutia that is based on, in many cases, on an entirely poor understanding of physics and reality, and they do not understand the larger issues that affect everything, like time. So, for instance, anybody that's ever gone through any kind of Ayurvedic training, Ayurvedic medicine, the truth of the body is really what Ayurveda means. But in any event, anybody who's ever gone through that knows that basically you're looking, depending on the body type, between 11 and 18 months. Doesn't matter what the drug is. You shouldn't take it longer than that because your body is subjected to the rigors of time. And guess what it does? Some cells die off and new ones are created. So you can say that within 18 months, those parts of your body, such as the liver, the kidneys, the spleen, lower intestine, not so much upper intestine, colon, the entire urethra and all of the excretory tracts there, as well as all of the blood vessels, the blood itself, the lymph, the plasma, and almost all of the cells involved in the internal absorption and flow of medicines will have been replaced in an 18-month period of time. This is not true of some of the longer-acting cells like in the liver and so on, and certainly not true of bones. But in many of your other structures, their cycle is relatively short and is done in a year and a half. So what is going on when, say, the cells of your body are going to swap out in a year and a half, and the doctors expect that these new cells, which have been trained to absorb and get rid of what they think of as a poison, the drugs you're giving them, are the doctors of the opinion that these new cells will not know about those drugs, will not be that much more efficient in dealing with them? I've dealt with the physicians and long-term prescriptions of drugs in Western medicine. I'm 59 years old. I've seen it for a lot of years here with a lot of people around me, and these doctors are abysmally ignorant. They do not understand the nature of what's going on with the progression of the human body. It's an evolution. If you give somebody alcohol to drink, they get really, really, really intoxicated. It's a toxic substance. Very first time it happens, they get really plastered. And of course, what happens? Well, over time, there are less and less effects from the same level of dose. Thus, you must increase the dose to achieve the same previous obtained level of effects. This is true of all addictions and all substances that way. This is because the body learns to metabolize. If it did not, then you could have the same level of alcohol each and every time in perpetuity to achieve the same level of effect, or any other drug, morphine or whatever. It wouldn't matter. And that's not what we have in reality. In reality, we have a very smart body that changes its cells out continuously. And I hate to tell you this, because most physicians won't really recognize it, but your body is the condensate. So if you are, say, 11 inches thick by, 17 inches wide at your widest point, that's your perception, and it's extremely limited because you might be an additional 6 to 8 feet on either side of that, and you might extend down into the ground or whatever surfaces, easily 3 to 4 feet, and have the other part of your actual body extend well up into the floor above you. But these are not the condensate. These are not the solid part of the body. These are the other things that, the woo-woo people will tell you are labeled as astral body and all of this kind of thing. It doesn't matter. It's the energy bodies that allow the condensate to form. that we use as our physical expression here in the materium. These larger bodies, though, participate in the absorption and interaction of time, and thus they affect the interior condensate body in its absorption and stuff of time. And you'll notice that people, for instance, you can as an aside, let me point out something. Someone gets a 10-year prison sentence, they will come out looking younger in the main, and have less physical effects than if they'd lived those 10 years outside of prison. Same thing is true of people in monasteries or other cloistered environments. And it has to do with their internal perceptions of time, as well, of course, the stresses of the life that they lead and all of this kind of thing. But arguably, there's as much stress or more so in prison than there is outside. Yet, why should prisoners consistently come out looking younger than if they'd been out serving the time? And again, it's serving the time, and it goes back to the nature of Chronos versus Kairos, which is the whole point of all of this, leading up to something else later on. So, if you really want to understand time and see it in language, you need to understand Latin. These people came up with so many different ways of refining and slicing and dicing and talking about time that they embedded it into their language in this subtle code that is probably should be the basis for the language that we use to discuss the nature of how we'll engineer with time in the future. It's just so that precise. Now, the Greeks have the emotional flavor down. They really captured the Kairos and understand the Chronos. We go on to the nature of time for drug cycles, because this is one of those macro versus micro, fractal expansion kind of things. So let's look at it this way. We could, in fact, make a series of projections based on this general understanding we have that our bodies cycle out over a relatively short period of time, 7 years. Your bones and everything will all cycle out over that period of time. So you get new cells. And since we know that drugs don't work on us at the same level of effect for the same level of dose, and the dosage must be increased over time to compensate for the fact that our bodies are really smart and are learning how to deal with these things that we're putting into them, and our bodies become more efficient over time unless you're poisoning them, as our society has deliberately attempted to do so. It's attempting to engineer, somebody up there, which we can get into that in a minute. Attempting to engineer the Nebish, a being who is not sensitive to Kairos and Chronos and would be the perfect slave, and then you could feed it any kind of drugs and it would just keep going. In any event, so it's my supposition, my postulate, that the Kairos and Chronos impacts on individuals from their cellular level all the way out affect not only our mental structures but also our society. And that our society goes through these Kairos and Chronos things on an 18-month cycle, as well as other smaller and larger cycles. Now, this gets us back to where we're at relative to the Kali Yuga and the long count, because the long count's ending in December and everybody's all freaked out about it. Plus, we've got Courtney Brown's remote viewing experiments that show that by June 1 of next year, we've had the shit kicked out of us in the southern hemisphere with water in specific locations, and the indications are that other areas are just as badly hit. Plus, we've got my further remote viewing experiments based on the Courtney Brown work from two different sources that support that same idea, that by June 1 of next year, we're going to have had some level of what we can think of as disaster. Now, we really should think of it as crisis, because within this period of time, we also have opportunity. We need to look at this the way the Chinese do. Yeah, we got a disaster, but there's going to be opportunity within the disaster to change our lives and to react as universe would have us harmonize and as it wants us to. It wants us to grow. You'll note in your own life that if you're smart enough, you'll be walking along and you'll observe some patterns in your life, and you'll see that there are things you want to avoid, for instance. You just don't want to have that conversation with, butthead, the neighbor, over that weird thing that's been bugging you for these past couple of months, years, days, whatever. And universe will nonetheless, in spite of your unwillingness to do so, will force you to have that conversation. It'll put you in a position where you must go through that. And that's because this is an education, not a schooling. And you've got to educate yourself and go through these experiences in order that you might grow and progress. And universe is just there to assist you in doing this. And in fact, you can say to yourself, and it's quite true, universe will always provide me with what I need and occasionally with what I want. The two are not necessarily the same. So anyway, here we are. We've got end of the Kali Yuga cycle. We've got all the control freaks going crazy over it, getting ready to declare martial law. They think the world's ending. In many respects, though, from their viewpoint, the world is ending. Because at the end of the Kali Yuga, all of the crap falls off, and we don't take this stuff anymore, the oppression, suppression. Once you get to the point in your life, as many people have noted, when you don't have anything to lose, when you've lost everything, you can just say, screw it, And there's also other approaches to the same view of dealing with the control freaks, the people at the top that are going batshit, and the reptilians and all of this, and that is, it comes down to a real truism. The most they can do is kill me. They can't defeat me. I'm eternal. I'll come back. I will come back not necessarily with the knowledge that in words and that kind of stuff, but I'll come back with that emotional force that makes me who I am now. In other words, undoubtedly, I'm so pissed at the papists because they were torturing me in a past life and taking my money and possessions and killing me when I was, one of the people they didn't like. That kind of stuff happens. So it is the nature of time that we have to deal with these things as a social order as well. Those people that are unaware of this nature will simply react to it. Those of us that are aware of what's going on probably should get out of the way, because I don't think we'll be able to wake up those that are simply going to react to it all. You're going to have those people on the one side that are the control freaks that are reacting to the feeling from universe that they're losing control of everything and their world is coming apart at the seams and they don't understand it and they're freaking out. A lot of this is ego driven. It doesn't want to die. It lives down in your gut and it totally freaks out when it thinks you're about ready to die. Get in a near-death situation and you'll see what I mean. So anyway, you got the control freaks. They know something's up. We can all feel it, and it's just rolling on down. They may not understand what they're feeling, and they're simply reacting to it, but they're going to be causing problems for the rest of it. We're going to see those problems in a number of different areas. We're seeing them all around us at this point. If you haven't yet, you're obviously not listening to my words, and you're out there, bowling for bucks in, Butte, Montana. Anyway, so some of the chief control freaks to watch out for to avoid getting in the way of some of their screwy-ass things, which won't succeed, but they'll try them nonetheless, and that's the danger, right? It doesn't matter if the explosion is a successful explosion or an accidental explosion. You don't want to be near it when it happens. So here's what you can do. You can keep abreast of what's going on at the Council for Foreign Relations, read between the lines on their site, and then read up on Tavistock and look at all of its various different outlets for mind control and all of this kind of stuff. It's hard to say who is the chief bad guy here, but I'm pretty sure CFR are just a bunch of stooges because they bring in all the actors and they've got all the huge ego-driven individuals there thinking they're really part of things. And a lot of the language about the induction into the CFR and the whole thing is about pandering. And so it's my thinking that, when you get to the real monastery guys that really know what they're doing at the very top, they don't pander. There's no need as an adult to get into that. So I don't think the CFR is at the top of things. I think there is one of these, implementation outlets, just like the Catholic Church and, Barack's death squads and all of that. So personally, I think Tavistock is way up there. Does the Tavistock group exist to support the Queen and all of that? I don't think so. Could the Queen royalty exist without Tavistock? I don't think so as well. They pre-existed, or they existed before Tavistock it was created. But these days, I think it takes the continual work of the Tavistock guys going 24 by 7, 365 continuously to keep the sheeple all drugged up enough that they accept this crap that we call royalty and get all whipped up about it. Anyway, so there are other outlets that you can look at as to what they're planning, but if you follow the CFR and Tavistock's outlets, and you just Google Tavistock, and you're going to get all kinds of disinfo, but it's worth the trouble to hunt through. I won't point out certain areas, because if I do, they'll just shut them down. This way, we'll have lots of people out there looking for the next way in which Tavistock is out screwing with people. And because they change continuously, they're not stupid. They tumble to this. The one area they've been stupid with has been this Godlike Productions outlet and their use of that. I mean, they've been messaging and memeing out of that for years. If you want to find out who's in the shit list and who's going to be getting trouble and have problems in the woo-woo world, go and read Godlike Productions. When you see somebody's name show up with a post that is at least 2 years out of date, you know that person, as the lead post for there, and they're resurrecting an old thread, then you know that person is their target. So let's take a personality. Let's say David Wilcock. Okay, so if there was a post on Godlike Productions now that came out with today's date as its starting point, that is not one of their little signals. But if they resurrected a post about him being a doofus back in 2009, that means that between 3 to 5 weeks from now, they plan on hitting him with a whole series of obstacles. They're going to put obstacles in his life. I've seen it repeatedly over the years, been watching the memes flow out of the gulpers, and so it's a good spot to see where Tavistock's going, but I don't rely on it as much anymore, simply because it's been used too long. I think they know people watch it, and that's another one of their plans, is once you discover them, then they know you've discovered it. As soon as they know you've discovered it, they keep it up and running, and they use it as disinfo and start muddying their own water. As I say, they're not stupid. They're clever. They're not really smart because they don't grasp a couple of things. But they are clever and dangerous. So, here we are. Let's get all the way down to the end of this thing so I can wrap it up and get some toast and filbert butter. The big problems for us start next year. We're into a crisis situation. There will be chaos, but there's opportunity in this chaos. We're going to have a disaster. Now, that's the bad news. We have a disaster, but we're in that. We know that. You only have to live in the middle of the country and be dying of heat as your air conditioner falls apart to know that we're in a disaster situation. Now we don't have what can be considered normal at all. Therefore, we need to look to the good news that we can get out of any of the elements that we can find. And I've got a really staggering one that was just never really showed up until this third set of validation remote viewing experiments that we've done. And you can dismiss remote viewing. You can dismiss it very easily, as I did for years. And I was shocked the first time that I actually encountered it and had it put to the test, and it passed the test with flying colors in terms of the information provided. So if you don't want to accept the remote viewing, that's fine. The remote viewing guys, though, in this third test that I did, validated something that we weren't even really testing for. And this is an observation that Courtney Brown's guys first came up with. And he says it in a particular way in his presentations. So he's using certain sets of words around it that I'm not going to, because I'm not approaching it from that viewpoint. But basically, here's the deal. In all of Courtney Brown's mini sessions, remote viewing sessions, and in all of the remote viewing sessions that we've done as validation for his work in the 2 studies that I've run, in none of those, post-disaster, is there any sign anywhere of government. So that's the good news. It's good on many, many, many levels. Now, it may be, like I say, that they've, gone into their hidey holes because this is only the first wave. What we're going through next year is only the first wave, and we won't be through this for a number of years, apparently until 2025 when everything settles down 100% back to, pies growing on trees and living to be 900 years, all of that kind of crap. Now, bear in mind, I'm not saying I believe that, but I do say that there are indeed projections for a time fusing, if you will, between the Kairos and the Chronos, and I can understand how that can happen, and I can explain it at an energetic level, which we didn't get into this time, so those people didn't get annoyed, but we'll do it some other point. It has to do with the 22 trillion times a second pulse and how all that works. In any event, though, we have many waves. The majority of it appears from our work with the WebBot stuff. We started seeing the future pop people really starting to establish themselves at these very low levels, 2017, 2018, and 2019, with 2018 being the first solid indicator. There were some hints that 2017 they were moving, but it's 2018 that we get the first indicator that there's some excuse me, intertribal communication between these various groups that do survive the upcoming disasters. And so that communication is basically what was being forecast, and that was the nature of our work. So I buy that as the basically the definitive statement from our viewpoint that there is humans, and they do come back and start doing things. Now, so we're going to have many waves. The first one is next year. But, hey, guys, the good news is we don't got to put up with the assholes no more, So next time when you reconstitute government, let's do things right. Let's make sure that every single judge cannot sit in their judging chamber without facing a mirror. Believe me, there is more to this than the psychological factors, and those psychological factors are more powerful than you can imagine anyway. But you should never have a judge of any kind that faces the audience or the assembled court without having a mirror prominent in their face. And let's just reconstitute it and do it in a more sane fashion and not listen to all the control freaks. So, like I say, the good news is government isn't around. Now, for a lot of people, that's bad news because they're dependent on government and they're going to have to change. Sorry, it's just, shit happens. We've all got to go through it. So if you're dependent on government, maybe you want to start thinking about that position and get your mindset a little bit looser by the time we get into December, because sometime between December and June of next year, according to the remote viewing experiments and the creepy hairs on the back of my neck that go crazy every time anything weird is passing, we're going to get hit by something. Now, it need not be incoming material. Let's stop here for a second and say there's this guy that's got seven layers of personality. This is this Sean David Morton fellow. He's got a really cool radio program on American Freedom Radio, and he gets into all kinds of interesting stuff, and he's like I say, he's got a lot of personality, so he's entertaining to listen to, and he has good information, and he's got a saying that he keeps going back to because of the book he wrote in his history, where he says that we won't be hit by incoming asteroids and stuff because he's seen the space machinery that we've got from lying on his back at Area 51. Now, I have also seen a lot of the space machinery that we've got with these third-generation night vision goggles. And they've got 8th-generation night vision goggles out there that show you the stuff even further out than my crude old stuff, which is quite old now. Nonetheless, there's all of those critters that you can see floating around. The triangle guys, the big bus things, and these things that look like submarines in space. And so, Sean's supposition is not without validity. They indeed probably have devices, gravity, propulsor things, and could even scoot on up to it and put a bomb on it if they wanted to shove something out of the way. That, however, does not mean we won't be hit by stuff from space because they may decide to allow it to happen. There are a hierarchy here. There's aliens or somebody in charge that does not apparently have my interest at heart, and that of a lot of other regular humans. And so I can't put it past them that they wouldn't allow it to occur. But in our work, in our global coastal event, there was never really any meteor kind of stuff. We had stuff for, strange energies from space, for incoming fireballs and those kind of problems, but they were never really the issue. The global coastal event, from our data viewpoint, appeared to be temporally related to this cracking of the Pacific Plate, which at the time that I was writing that in 2003, I never really understood. 2003 through 2006, we were getting all of the data. I never really understood how that could occur, absent something like, a meteor coming in and slamming into it. But given the expansion of the planet model, which we now know to be accurate because we've seen Mercury expand and Venus has expanded, both of which are live planets, unlike Mars, which is a dead planet. Earth is a live planet, and it is also expanding. So the plates will crack as it expands from the middle out. This cracking of the Pacific Plate would be indeed enough to cause a global coastal event, and it's the thing that would cause the plate to crack is a unseen but certainly experienced incoming energies from the sun that go zipping down right through us, all these high energy particles right through us to the middle of the planet. The middle of the planet captures them in this giant plasma ball that's down there, and it creates matter there out of this energy because it gets trapped. It's got to do something with it. And so it creates enough matter, and eventually it has to crack its shell in order to accommodate the matter that's in the middle of the planet and needs to come out. This would support, abiotic oil and all of that kind of stuff. But getting back to the Pacific Plate issue, that crack alone, would cause sufficient problems that it would meet our definition for the global coastal event, and likely would also cause the same southern hemisphere-wide, apparently, disaster that was seen unexpectedly in the farsight.org Courtney Brown's remote viewing experiment. Therefore, it's not necessary, in my view, that we get hit by anything from space for this to still occur. We will be getting hit by the energy, which causes the whole thing to pop off. Could be, though, that we are in fact hit by debris, because our conal section and the area we traverse within that conal section within the helical model has brought us a lot closer to a lot of the debris of the asteroid belt. And we're seeing some of the effects of that with these fireballs across Russia that are setting Siberian villages on fire and creating such levels of fire that over here in the Pacific Northwest, clear across the Pacific, we're dealing with the smoke from it. So, basically it kind of doesn't matter to me. I'm sort of preparing for the global coastal event. I don't know how I'm going to react relative to my 105-foot elevation off of Puget Sound, but I am 100 miles inland on one direction and over 35 miles inland another direction from any direct ocean effect. So if I was living in Seattle, Everett, Bellingham Bay, any of the inner island areas around the straits, at this level of elevation, I would be a little bit more concerned, because that's where a large amount of water would come into. But because of the nature of Puget Sound, it'll take a while before, and a lot of that energy would be dissipated before it would get down to us down here. And we're also not even convinced that even a meteor strike or a displacement wave generated by a cracking of the Pacific Plate would cause the kind of wave that would go all the way this far north. We do know from the remote viewing experiments and the validation that I've done that the water problem seen within the remote viewing goes at least as high as latitude 30 degrees. So it goes as high as the equatorial bulge. So for instance, in our data, it shows that there's water issues that will hit the coast of California and southern Oregon. It shows that Hawaii has them. The remote viewing work that they did at the farsight.org shows that Hawaii has problems. And, areas along the East Coast, Florida, etc., including as high as the latitude 30 degrees, like I note, where we have Washington, D.C. But this is also not a inundation wave that stays there. So it's a wave that comes on in, overwashes, and then goes back out in some period of time before June. If it was a large enough wave, it might happen in February, and it might take a number of months for it to finally drain out in many of these different areas. We don't know what the play-by-play is going to be, but we do know that by June, the areas have been devastated by water, but there's not standing water there. Now, in the validation studies that I've done, for the remote viewing part, it shows that in Puget Sound, water is not our issue, at least insofar as it has occurred by late May. We chose a slightly different time frame. Our issues are earthquakes, which would be expected with a Pacific plate cracking, earthquakes to the point where we have building devastation, like, buildings fall down, 3- and 4-story buildings just shake themselves to pieces. And we're pretty well built here for in the past dozen years, 20 years, we've been building for earthquakes with some seriousness. So I suspect it'll be the older buildings in this area. But nonetheless, the data shows very violent earthquakes, and at the same time, a series of very violent storms that are apparently wind-driven. Now, this would make sense with either a displacement from a crack in the Pacific plate and or from the being struck by, space debris. Just either way, it would result in these two effects. This far north, we would expect to get the earthquakes from any kind of a plate crack, and it would be the same if the planet was hit by a large object. We would expect, that we'll ring, that we'll get earthquakes all over. We didn't do a lot of validation on specific geographic locations. We weren't hunting for safe zones. We weren't doing any of that kind of work. What we were trying to do specifically was to validate some of the referential points within the Courtney Brown stuff. And then, coincidentally, we discovered the cool thing, which is no government. We don't have to deal with these bastards. And, I used to be in government. I used to work local government. Not everybody that works there is in any way a bastard. But there's people at the top that are directing everybody else that truly are bastards, and I don't like them much. And I guess I'll just say that that's the end here today. Let me check my notes real quick. Yeah, so if you want to see what's going down politically and economically, check on the Tavistock guys. The economy is puking all over itself. The Baltic Dry Index is falling to pieces. The August 12th thing here with the closing ceremonies. If we're going to see any kind of an event, then the first impact would be, economically, would be on that day in the Asian markets, but we wouldn't really see it here until the 13th. And coincidentally, we're seeing some weird put activity relative to the 13th as opposed to... But in any event, though, the ratio of new puts is climbing. I'm not an expert in the money stuff. I don't follow it that well. I do know that the amount of dollar amounts are massive in my viewpoint. I've got a friend of mine that's an expert in the economic stuff, and he says the ratios are very high compared to recent activity. And what's troublesome in his mind is not that it looks like a pre 2000 or 9/11. It doesn't look to him like a pre 9/11 put pattern, but rather appears to be a pre-Iraq war kind of a replica. So in his mind, it's telegraphing a outbreak of war hostilities in the Middle East, as opposed to telegraphing an attack on the Olympic Games. We don't know. August 12th is just so significant in so many different ways. And then we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which are from various different economic viewpoints forecast to be the point at basically somebody just pulls the plug out of the drain and lets it all swirl around and go. So, damn, this took nearly an hour. I've got to get some stuff going here. Sorry I took so much time on all of this. We're getting into a strange period. They may declare martial law. They may just go absolutely crazy in all of this. My feeling anymore is I'm not sweating it so much. They won't be around in 8-9 months. So I'm not going to worry about it. The rest of us will be, and we can get something going. Thanks, guys.